everyone. It's a glad welcome bringing you another episode of The Facts, the series that discusses political international issues. Today we have the privilege to be joined by two respected guests, Mr. Shabbir Hassanali and Mr. Khaled Al Kassimi. Today we would like to discuss about the Idlib operation in Syria. Thanks for being with us. What is the situation of Idlib operation now, in your idea?
I'm answering this question on the 15th of February 2020, and as of then, from what we can understand, the Syrian Arab Army and allied forces have been making a lot of headway in Idlib and, of course, in western Halab, western Aleppo. And today they actually resumed their movement back into Idlib, the larger sort of province of Idlib, especially in eastern Idlib. And today I believe they captured the town of Ma'arat al-Nisan. And from that town, the army has been able to, based on the latest information that I have, they've been able to sort of control the Taftanaz airbase, where there seems to be a large Turkish force deployed. So, you know, there is movement going on. It would also seem that, based on information, some of the Turkish people, Kurdish people rather, units, have started opening new fronts against Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is an Al-Qaeda-backed group, and other Turkish-backed factions in the northwestern Halab, northwestern Aleppo countryside. So really, from what we can gather from this is that the Syrian army and its allied forces are making a lot of movement, they're making a lot of successful headway, and unfortunately it seems that the Turkish government is supporting the Al-Qaeda-backed groups such as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and the Free Syrian Army and all of this, which is a strategic mistake which will be, you know, it will have no positive result for the Turkey government, for the Turkish government. We also know that as of very recently, the M5 highway between Damascus and Aleppo is now clean of Al-Qaeda, Daesh, all of these troops, and it's very much a case of it's cleaning up now, really. You know, if we look at Syria is in a state where it's now cleaning up all of the Takfiri and Al-Qaeda and related factions from its own territory. And it's extremely unfortunate that Turkey has seen this time to become a pawn of NATO and work against this honourable action of Syria and the resistance. So this is the current situation of the war at the moment in Syria.
What is the strategic importance of liberation of Idlib, Mr. Hassanali?
Well, first of all, Idlib is the last bastion of the Takfiris in Syria, at least in western Syria. And it's historically, Idlib and Idlib province have always been with the government. They've been friendly with the government. They've been supportive of the government, and over the course of this imposed war of terror on Syria that began as part of the so-called Arab Spring. And that was hijacked, of course, by America, by Saudi and other countries-backed forces. We can see that, I mean, in the beginning, of course, we saw that a lot of Syria had been damaged and taken over by Daesh, Al-Qaeda, Jabhat al-Nusra, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, and all of these other different groups which have varying different names, but ultimately are just Takfiri organizations funded generally out of Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states, and of course supported and nurtured by the Zionists, and of course with all of these organizations there is a large amount of American support and American guidance, I think, for them. And you know, the Americans, of course, we know have been constantly bombing those people who have been fighting these Takfiris. Of course, we know recently, just at the beginning of 2020, we saw that the Americans came along and killed the single most influential person in the fight against Daesh and Takfiris, which was, of course, the martyr Haj Qasem Soleimani, may God rest his pure soul. So, you know, with that background, we can see Idlib is the last area, or the last partial area now, that is still a holdout for the Takfiris that they can use to regroup and be fed by their allies, be they in Israel, be they in, unfortunately, in Turkey and such places. And of course America airdropping equipments and weapons to them from time to time. Idlib is also along the coast of the Mediterranean, and in that way it provides a lot of strategic depth to Syria. While Idlib is occupied, as is the case today, although that is gradually being liberated, literally day by day, it's important for the Syrian government and its associated resistance axis forces to clean this Idlib from this Takfiri influence and to free this place. Strategically, it will open up the door to more access to the Mediterranean. It will create more of a buffer against any Turkish adventure. And it ultimately it's Syrian territory that needs to be liberated and freed from external invasion, external occupation. So in terms of that, there is a lot of strategic importance. In terms of geopolitical importance, as long as there is even 1 nanometer of Syrian territory that is occupied by the enemies, this leaves Syria vulnerable. And of course we know large amounts of eastern Syria are still occupied by the Americans. So in order to strengthen itself, in order to recover from this imposed war that Syria has been suffering for many years now, it needs to clean up the west of Syria, which is, of course, Idlib and parts of the suburbs or the countryside of Aleppo, which is currently being enacted. It's happening today as we speak. And once that is done, then it will leave the Syrian forces and related Syrian and resistance forces in a position where they can tackle the issues in the eastern side of Syria, where the Americans have tried to, well, they've occupied Syria's limited oil refinery, oil capabilities. They have attempted to provide succor to groups like the SDF and others in the eastern side, as well as in the western side, but the western side is being cleaned up, the eastern side is still there. But once the west is cleaned up, then Syria can focus its eyes on cleaning up the eastern side of Syria. And of course, in this, it can expect, I'm sure, the support and assistance of the PMU from Iraq. But until Idlib and everything is still occupied, it would not be the right move to just, leave that alone and go for the other side. So in that way, it's also got a lot of strategic importance.
Turkey still tries to support militias in Idlib against Syrian army. Why is Idlib so important for Turkey, Mr. Hassanali? What's your idea in this regard?
Well, Turkey, unfortunately, because of miscalculations and because of mistakes, and I suppose listening to promises of those people who might tell Turkey they're well-wishers but who have no thought for the best interests of Turkey, found itself in a position where it was supporting some of these reactionary terrorist forces that came along from the outside world to harm Syria. And ultimately the intention, of course, as we know, to harm Syria means to harm the resistance axis. So when you have a country that is doing this, and of course we must remember a number of things about Turkey, that while on the surface Turkey appears to be an Islamic government, a Muslim government, it's friendly and everything to the Muslims, as it were. It sometimes makes a lot of noises in support of the Palestinian cause. We must remember that Turkey, first of all, is a member of NATO, and Turkey also has a very, very close diplomatic, security, and military relationship with the Zionist entity. And anyone who's done any research on the Syria subject knows that the Zionist entity is instrumental in attempting to destabilize Syria and has been directly supporting some of these terrorist organizations, Al-Qaeda groups essentially, such as Jabhat al-Nusra and others like Nuruddin Zinki and others. So Turkey is in an interesting position where I'm certain, and this is based on conversations I've had with people within Turkey, the people of Turkey are against Turkish interference in Syria, categorically. They're against Turkey's relationship with Israel and its membership of NATO as well, but many people are vehemently against Turkish gains inside Syria. There's also a move at this time that Iran is doing to try and sort of calm Turkey down and sort of get Turkey to see sense and understand that, look, doing the bidding of NATO, which is essentially doing the bidding of the empire, is a mistake. And Russia is also, of course, supporting Iran on this diplomatic endeavor. Turkey, I think, feels that it needs to have some sort of buffer. And if we cast our minds back a few years, Turkey was the main proponent of a no-fly zone over the northwestern part of Syria, which thankfully didn't happen, but that Mr. Cameron and others were really singing about and waving the flag about. Turkey wants control of that portion of Syria. Part of it, I believe, is because Turkey is manipulated and sometimes I believe the government doesn't always know what it's doing, and it makes lots of miscalculations. And of course this is because of the close influence it has with the Israelis, who of course manipulate everything. Mossad's motto, even though they say they might have changed it, its real motto is, by way of deception you will make war. And even though Turkey might be on the surface in a friendly relationship with so-called Israel, it would be foolhardy for Turkey to think that Israel is not its enemy. It is. Israel might pretend to be its friend, but Israel is friends of no one, not even the Americans. Israel is extremely self-centered. The Zionist project is a self-centered project, and it only cares about itself. And when I say itself, I don't mean the Jews, because the Jews and the Zionism are a very separate thing. There's no commonality between the two. Same way Wahhabism and Islam are not connected. There is no commonality between the two. As I've said before, both Zionism and Wahhabism have usurped the good name of Judaism, Christendom and Islam, and manipulate these divine Abrahamic faiths to further agendas that have nothing to do with these faiths. So Turkey, I feel, is being taken for a ride. It's a mistake what it is doing. In Idlib, it needs to walk away and not support these Takfiri terrorists. Now, some people say that this is because Turkey is, the government in Turkey, the current party, Mr. Erdogan's party, is affiliated to Ikhwan al-Muslimin or the Muslim Brotherhood. And because of this, maybe there is truth in that. I'm not looking at it from that perspective of little factions and everything. I'm looking at it more from, if I was a Turk, what would I be doing? And the reality is, if I was a Turk, I would be imploring my government to leave Syria alone. Syria should be a friend of Turkey, and it was. Historically, there was no issues. Just like Syria is a friend with Iran, Syria can be a friend with the Turks without any problem. But unfortunately, the current government in Turkey has decided it wants to do NATO's bidding, and as a result, it will fund and play with. And of course, there's a lot of economic games being played. Saudi Arabia, of course, we know. Saudi Arabia, unfortunately, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, etc., UAE. All of these governments are, paying for the nurturing of Daesh. And, I mean, let's be brutally honest, none of these Gulf Arabs would know what to do with a gun or a weapon. They need other people to fight their battles. Just see what's happening in Yemen. They're having to bring Africans and Sudanese and Somalis and Pakistanis and all these people to fight, and Americans, Israelis to fight the war. Because, of course, the Saudis themselves, it takes effort for them to tie their own shoelaces. Let alone, toast a piece of bread or, even brush their teeth. They're incompetent and they have no ability. So what do? They throw money at the problem. And Turkey, being in an economic strife, and having this problem of wanting to be part of Europe, while at the same time being a bridge to Europe and Asia, Turkey sometimes gets a little bit, unfortunately, confused. And so it makes mistakes economically. It becomes behooving to the World Bank and the IMF, and it runs out of money, essentially, which creates problems internally. It misspends or it spends money wrongly. And so Saudi Arabia or one of these other countries come along and throw billions of US dollars at the Turkish government, and the Turkish government is then beholden to these entities and has to do their will, at least for a limited amount of time. Just like a mercenary, you pay a mercenary, a few $100,000. That mercenary will do your bidding for, say, a month, for 6 months, half a day, whatever, whatever the rate is. And this is unfortunately what Turkey has become. Turkey should really look more at itself and build up its own honor and dignity, and not allow itself to become a pawn, to become a tool of both the empire, that is the United States and NATO, and also not become a tool of Saudi and Kuwait and all of these countries, and Israel. And rather it should be independent, and an independent Turkey should be working closely with Russia, with Iran, with Syria, to solve the problems of the West Asia region, and not to compound them further by supporting these takfiris who are interested in creating chaos and who have no relationship to Islam but are paid mercenaries. And actually anyone who is interested, the fact that these takfiris, the white helmets, the Al-Qaeda, Jabhat al-Nusra, all of this has all been exposed. All of this information is available on the internet in multiple places with compelling evidence. Just because it's not in the mainstream media, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It's very much there. These people are known to be terrorists, the same terrorists that allegedly flew planes into the World Trade Center. It's the same groups, the same ideology, the same mentality. So Turkey has a very confused strategy at the moment, I feel, with regard to Syria. It's being played, and I think it's high time the Turks realize that they're better than this, they have more honor than this, and that they should listen to their Iranian and Russian brothers who are trying to bring sanity to a situation that ultimately, look, Syria is making headway in Idlib. Syria will clean Idlib and the rest of Syria from the Takfiri danger. This is a given. There's no doubt about this anymore. And Turkey will just end up looking like someone who is very foolish if it continues to side with these terrorists, with the Al-Qaeda groups. And so it needs to back away, return back to within its own borders, allow Syria to get on with what it needs to do, and work with Syria to make sure that all of these terrorist groups are removed. I mean, Turkey has made a lot of strategic mistakes since Daesh came along. I mean, there was evidence that Turkey was responsible for funneling Daesh sold oil to places like Israel and even parts of Europe. So Turkey is, has been played, has made many, many miscalculations, and now it's in a unique historical position where you've got Iran and Russia who are sitting down and discussing with Turkey to, to sort of bring some sanity to the situation. And I would implore, the Turkish government to please listen to reason. Don't make yourselves the slaves of empire. Make yourselves free as you should be and as you are. Hold your head up high as a brave, strong Muslim country. And don't be someone who essentially acts in a manner that is like the Rottweiler or the rabid dog of the empire. Turkey is better than this, and Turkey needs to realize that. After all, doing the bidding of the empire that is attempting to make coups d'etats against the current government of Turkey. There is no value for Turkey to support America or NATO, because NATO and America have all betrayed Turkey. So Turkey needs to step away from Syria. It needs to stop listening and taking orders from Washington and London and places. And it needs to start working for Turkey and for the West Asia region as a whole. And I think, having explained what the strategy seems to be for Turkey, I think this is the best advice that I can give as a Muslim brother to my, to the Turkish government. They're better than what is happening today. They can be better, and they will be better if they listen to the advice and the guidance and the discussions of their friends from Iran and from Russia.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hassanali, for your answers. Our next question is for you, Mr. Kassimi. Do you think there will be a direct conflict between Syrian army and Turkish forces anytime soon?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for having me on your show again. In relation to your first question, whether I think Syrian forces will be engaging Turkish forces, it's actually a very important question, the way it's posed, because since 2011, the Arab Syrian army has been fighting mercenaries, non-state actors, right? Even though non-state actor is kind of confusing because these mercenaries were authorized by states, so to call them non-state actors is illogical. These mercenaries were authorized by governments. So to go back to my initial point, the reason why it's an important question is because for the first time, the Turkish army is now directly confronting the Syrian army. Okay? So we're back to classical warfare, if you'd like. Instead of having, an army fighting networks or mercenary groups all over, right? You now have an army willing and capable of engaging another army. That's the first point that I want to make. And the reason for that point, the importance of it, is because when armies are fighting each other, you know that there's going to be a deadline or an expiry date for that battle. In difference to when an army is fighting mercenaries, mercenaries keep coming and going, right? It's a recycling phase. So in Syria, there's been over 150,000 mercenaries that have died, right? On the Arab Syrian army side, there's been over 200,000 Arab Syrian soldiers that have passed away since 2011. And the deaths are consistent, right? And that's because the war that imperial powers have activated in Syria is non-conventional, right? It's an army versus mercenary groups. Okay, so to kind of answer your question directly, will there be a direct conflict between the Arab Syrian army and the Turkish forces anytime soon? There already has been a confrontation. However, will that escalate to an all-out war? I can guarantee you that that will not happen. The reason why I'm assured of this is precisely because Turkey violated the Sochi Memorandum Understanding, they call it the SMU, which was signed on September 17th, 2018 between Russia, Turkey, Iran, and the Syrian government in Sochi. And the reason why this is an important kind of piece of information for us to understand why Turkey will not be engaging directly the Syrian army again is because the Sochi Memorandum Agreement explicitly says that there's a de-escalation zone from 15 to 20 kilometers, right? All radical terrorist groups need to leave Idlib, the northwestern part and the northeastern part of Syria. It specifically says that tanks, artillery, any piece of weapon that is not under the Arab Syrian army authorization will be perceived as violating territorial Syrian Arab sovereignty. The Turkish and the Russians agreed that any monitoring of troops or areas have to be coordinated between the Turkish and the Russians. Okay. Now the issue with this is that, and actually, one of the most important points of the Sochi Memorandum is the free movement of local residents and goods along the M4 and M5 highway. So the M4 highway connects Aleppo to Ladikhiya, and the M5 connects Aleppo to Hama. These were all agreed upon in 2018. Now, a few weeks ago, you had the Turkish army cross into, violated the de-escalation zone line, and what they ended up doing is attempting to take a Syrian base north of Sarakhed, and that airbase is known as the Taf Tanaz airbase. And that's why the Syrian army opened fire and killed, I don't know, I think it was 5 or 6 Turkish soldiers. So technically, the Syrian government firing on Turkish soldiers last week is legal, because according to the agreement, you violated the conditions that we agreed upon. So, will there be a direct conflict between the Syrian army and the Turkish army? Yes. If Turkey continues to violate the treaty that it has agreed upon with the Syrian government and the Russian government, the Syrian government will continue to respond on Turkish forces. And last but not least, we need to remember that even if none of this happened, let's say there wasn't a violation of the Accords, of the Sochi Accords, it's sufficient that the Turkish army engages, it's sufficient that the Syrian army engages the Turkish army simply because Turkey is colonizing Idlib, the northern province of Syria, which is the breadbasket of Syria, the most important natural gas area in Syria, including oil, in relation to livestock, cows, lambs, all of that. That's all situated in Idlib. It's a highly fertile area. So those are several reasons as to why the Syrian government, if the Syrian government realizes that Turkey is not going to be staying loyal to the agreement, then it will continuously engage the Turkish army. Another important point I would say in relation to this, sorry, I'm just going over my notes, is that Russia and Syria, they actually have control over the airspace of Idlib. So there are no Turkish or any American Air Force that flies over Idlib. It's specifically Syrian airspace, right? The reason why Russia can fly is because, again, they coordinated this with the sovereign country of Syria. So let's say Turkey does engage the Syrian army, engages in sending mercenaries to do, let's say, suicide attacks funded by HTS, the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which are a terrorist group. Let's say Turkey decides to go that lane and ends up, because Turkey is not really simply engaging from its own will, right? It's obviously taking orders as well from the Americans. If Turkey decides to continuously engage the Syrian army, it's a lost war, especially because Syrians are fighting for their land, right? That's one. Two, Turkey doesn't have air reinforcement, right? Syria has air reinforcement. It also has Russian aircraft carriers off Latakia and Tartus who can actually fire into northern Idlib if they receive an order from the Syrian government to give them air cover. Those are all things that Turkey does not have. As a matter of fact, one of my colleagues said a really important point a few days ago, and he mentioned that after 2016, when the Turkish coup d'etat occurred, the Turkish government dismissed 3/4 of its Air Force pilots, which means that Turkey's F-16 fighter jets, a lot of them can be piloted, right? Because Turkey doesn't have sufficient pilots. Obviously, that can be solved. You can always bring in NATO pilots from other countries. But if we're talking specifically about capabilities, right? Turkey is not capable of engaging the Syrian government as it currently stands. Okay? So the highways M5 and M4 are very important highways because they literally they're the arteries of Syrian territory when it comes to the economic livelihood of the country. And those were all agreed upon in the Sochi agreement, as I said. So Turkey is actually violating a memorandum that was agreed upon. So if Turkey continues to want to violate that memorandum, you can guarantee that the Syrian government will continuously engage them. And I don't think that Turkey will be in the position to want to engage the Syrian government, especially since opposition members in Turkey under Oglu are, explicitly saying in the parliament that the Turkish government under Erdogan have been directly implicated in funding terrorists, with the direction of Israel, the United States, and other European countries. So, any way you turn it, it seems like Turkey is cornered. Turkey might respond here and there, like it did a few days ago, but it will definitely not commit to engaging the Syrian army, simply for the reasons that I alluded to earlier.
What is the current situation of U.S., Russian, and Iranian forces and bases in Syria, and what is their plan in Syria?
In relation to American bases in Syria, it's important to remember that in northeastern Syria right now, so in areas like Qamishli, Hasake, there are a lot of inhabitants of these areas who are resisting American presence in these regions. We saw several videos a few days ago, but this has actually been going on for months. So, and especially when we consider what occurred in Iraq in January with the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, may he rest in peace. What we realize is, the Iraqis saying we want to remove American presence from Iraq. Syria has been wanting to remove American presence since 2011. So now with these two geographies, Syria and Iraq, coming together under one narrative saying we want the imperial power of the United States to leave our areas, here we can start seeing, or we can start expecting in the next few days, in the next few weeks, operations either from local inhabitants. They don't have to be conscripted in the Syrian army. It can literally be just regular people, which happens all the time in the Middle East. So if you look at Yemen, for instance, a lot of the Yemenis who are fighting Al-Qaeda members in Yemen, they're actually not part of the army. And even if they are, a lot of them are, Yemenis who want to fight for the freedom and liberty of, their land, their family. So we need to start realizing that the Syrian army highly benefits from its own citizens taking matters in their own hands and actually resisting colonialism by the Americans, right? Just like the Iraqis did in 2003, a lot of people forget that some of the most ferocious resistance groups in Iraq that fought the Americans were individuals from Tikrit, Najaf, Anbar, Tikrit, Baghdad. These were all areas that actually took matters in their own hands and said, okay, we have a colonial power in our country right now, we're going to engage it physically. So American troops, directly speaking, specifically speaking about American troops, I do see them leaving Syria in the next, honestly, I couldn't tell you, I can't give you a timeline, but we are seeing the beginning of the end of American troops in Syria. And also don't forget that the UN ambassador for Syria, Bashar Jafari, last week said Idlib has around 80 to 90,000 mercenaries. Okay? 1. 2, the northern part of Syria is very important for economic reasons. As I said earlier, it's the breadbasket of Syria. So with the United States having a base in northern Syria, right, expect the Syrian army, just like it would engage the Turkish army, it will engage the American army, right? Now, the interesting part is that the engagement might not be Arab Syrian army versus Turkish army. It might be guerrilla groups, okay? It might be militias who are authorized by the Syrian government to engage the Americans, okay? So that would be kind of a game changer in Syria, especially since as I said, we're seeing kind of a parallel between Iraq and Syria saying we want Americans out. So we will start seeing kind of more pressure on the Americans to actually leave, especially if we start seeing body bags, right? If we start seeing American troops dying, right, that's going to create more pressure on the American administration to actually pull out of Syria. In relation to Iranian forces, Iran, you see, it's not that it's a problem, it's that Iran does have a lot of, it's obviously, one, it was invited by the Syrian government to help the Syrian government eliminate terrorism. However, there has been a lot of organizations in Iran, such as the Badr organization, the peace companies, or the popular mobilization units, the PMUs. Some of them are in Syria, and at some point when all of this ends, they will obviously leave Syrian territory because there's no longer the threat that required you to be here, right? So just like any war, when your allies are there to help you, when your allies see that there's no longer a reason for them to be here, they will leave. And if they don't leave, then that's a totally different story until then, right? I'm not going to assume the worst, but what I will assume is that Iran has helped Arabs in Syria specifically. Have there been organizations that committed some crimes in Syria that were part of organizations such as the Badr organization, the Mahdi army, the peace companies? Yes, there has been. Okay, but that doesn't mean that these people represent Qasem Soleimani, may he rest in power. That doesn't mean that they represent the Iranian elite. So suffice to say, Iran was invited by a sovereign country into Syria, and Iran will leave Syria when Syria realizes that it no longer needs its help. Period. Politics. That's directly my political kind of answer to that. In relation to Russia, Russia has had bases in Syria for a long time, since I think from the 60s or 70s. I don't think that Russia will be closing its bases in Ladikia or Tartus anytime soon. I actually wouldn't recommend that they shut down their bases, precisely because we're dealing with an international system that is highly realist. It's realpolitik, security dilemma, a very an international system that is very strict when it comes to the security of geostrategy. So Russia being in Syria allows the United States to not think about actually crossing deeper into Syrian territory, because that will be a declaration of war. So that's realism, in a sense that you empirically see that there are troops, bases, Air Force units of Russia on Syrian territory. That will automatically be a deterrent for other countries to not actually want to complete their project in Syria of fully destroying the country, removing the government, etc. So I don't see Russia leaving Syria, and I don't even actually think Arabs would want Russia to leave in that sense. And when I say Arabs, I'm not talking about everybody. I'm talking about Arabs who believe that the Arab Syrian government has been fighting for its existence, right? The fight in Syria is not the fight for an individual, Bashar al-Assad. It's a fight for Arab civilization, right? Damascus, Aleppo are some of the most important spaces of Arab civilization. And we saw spaces of Arab civilization systematically becoming destroyed, whether in Baghdad, whether in Sana'a in Yemen, whether in Tripoli in Libya. Aleppo in Syria was pretty much 70% decimated, right? So I align with the Syrian government, currently represented by the President Bashar al-Assad, and I fully trust and entrust the politicians involved in Syria right now in actually taking the correct decisions, right, and actually determining who do we benefit from having them in the country, right? So the Russia, Iran, and other groups, if they're willing to help Syria eliminate a foreign intervention and death squads, by all means, right? We can't forget that South Africa had people come in from Cuba, had people come in from Libya, people coming in from even the PLO at some point were helping South Africans during apartheid. And when that ended, everybody left. Everybody went back to their respective countries. So we can't equate Russia and Iran with the presence of the United States. So that's kind of my explanation on Russian presence, Iranian presence, and American presence in Syria. So in kind of concluding that question, Russia is not a colonial power, Iran is not a colonial power. They were invited legally by the Arab Syrian government. The United States was not invited, right? Turkey was not invited. So legally speaking, according to international law, you are then violating the sovereignty of that country. Now, if the discussion is that Syria isn't sovereign, then that's a totally different argument, because now we're talking about an international system that thinks Arabs aren't civilized enough to have sovereignty.
Thank you very much for your answer. Our next question is about your idea about the liberation of Idlib. Do you think that is it possible for Idlib to be liberated? And if so, how much time do you think it will take?
And that's a totally different question, which I will not get into. But in relation to your final question, do I think the liberation of Idlib is possible? And if so, how long do you think it'll take? As I said, I don't know. I can't really quote something that I'm not sure of. But what I am for sure is that when the Syrian president Bashar al-Assad stated a few months ago that every inch of Syrian territory will be liberated, and as I just said 2 minutes ago, I trust the government, then I could guarantee you that Idlib, the northern part of Syria, will be liberated sooner or later. What we are seeing right now in the past few weeks is kind of an acceleration of the liberation of Idlib. Idlib needs to be brought back into Arab Syrian sovereignty. Economically speaking, it's very important. Turkey and the United States cannot, and I repeat this, they cannot witness the result of them staying there. I guess what I'm trying to say is, if the United States and Turkey are stubborn in wanting to remain in northern Syria, they need to be ready to witness resistance groups, operations that will force them to leave. This has been going on for way too long. You have over 600,000 people who have died in Syria. Over 200,000 of these individuals are Arab Syrian soldiers. Again, over 300 of them, over 300,000 are civilians. And as I said, over 100,000 are mercenaries. So it's reached a point where Syria is confident that it will regain all of territories, and it seems like they're on the road to liberation, especially since the highways, the M5, is now under government control, and that's a very important strategic area because that cuts off arms and logistical corridors from Turkey to actually send weapons to the mercenaries. So when the M4 with the M4 and M5 highway being under Syrian control, what we end up noticing is the gradual kind of dismantlement of Turkish observatory posts. You'll see gradually the United States pulling out of Syria, precisely because they no longer have logistical corridors, and that is pretty much gradually gonna require the United States and Turkey to declare that they're ejecting themselves from Arab Syrian territory.
I'm very thankful to both of you, Mr. Hassanali and Mr. Kassimi, for your informative explanations in this subject. We would like to see you again in this program, and thank you also, audience, for being with us, and goodbye.